The rain had fallen steadily for 2 days in Green Hollow, turning the dirt roads to slick ribbons and the trees to weeping silhouettes in the pale morning light. Rosa Whitman stood on the wooden porch of her childhood home, her hands folded over the handle of her battered suitcase. The locket around her neck, a dull brass heart engraved with the letter M, warmed slightly against her skin as her breath came out in puffs. She would miss this porch, the place where her mother had once brushed her hair with soft, deliberate strokes. The smell of rain-soaked honeysuckle floated from the garden. The scent would fade from memory soon, she feared, like so many other things that once seemed permanent. The stagecoach stood waiting at the bottom of the path, its wheels half sunk into the muddy road. 2 horses snorted and pawed at the soft earth, their manes thick with mist. The driver stood leaning against the side, chewing on a twig, watching her without speaking. Her mother fussed with the edge of her shawl, not quite meeting her eyes. "You packed your letters?" she asked. "The ones he sent?" Rosa nodded. "Yes, Mama. And the envelope with the directions?" "It's in my handbag. You'll need to change lines in St. Louis. Ask someone for help if you get turned around." "I will." Behind her, Grace stood quietly, eyes rimmed with sleep and sorrow. Rosa glanced down at her little sister, the hem of her nightgown peeking out from beneath her overcoat. She'd braided her hair hastily, and her eyes were red from crying. "Right when you get there," Grace said. "Please." "I will," Rosa replied, brushing a curl from Grace's cheek. "First thing." Her father emerged from the parlor, hat in hand. He did not speak, only looked at her with the weight of unspoken words pressing down between them. He had been the one to suggest she write to the paper in Missouri. He had even clipped the advertisement for her. A decent man with land and prospects was seeking a bride, someone who could handle the roughness of the frontier and was, in his own words, of hardy character. Her father had seen the way folks in Green Hollow looked at Rosa, the way the boys passed her over at socials, how shopkeepers politely but curtly smiled when she passed. And maybe he'd felt sorry. Or maybe he'd simply wanted her to have what few choices lay available to a girl like her. Rosa had studied the man's letters by candlelight, savoring every word. Walter had a neat, blunt script. He lived near Dodge's Creek, ran a small cattle ranch, and claimed to be tired of cooking for one. He wrote kindly with a dry wit. When she'd enclosed her photograph, she had waited weeks for his reply. And when it came with no mention of her appearance, only that he hoped she was a strong woman, built for work and company, she took it as a quiet acceptance. Now, Rosa turned away from her family and stepped down the creaky porch steps. Mud squelching beneath her boots, she didn't look back. If she did, she might not go. The journey was long and tiring. The coach was crowded, first with other travelers heading west, and then with freight as they drew farther from the cities. Her companions changed, often merchant women, Union veterans, children traveling to live with relatives. Rosa spoke little but listened much. She heard stories of land disputes, of cholera, of long winters and strong winds. But always, the West shimmered just ahead like a mirage, wide, wild, promising. She held Walter's letters close, reading them again each night. She tried to imagine his voice, his manner. Would he have a kind face? Would he find her pleasing, despite what the world might say about her size? Rosa had grown used to being described as a sturdy girl, and big-boned, terms that were often compliments when spoken by her mother and weapons when hurled by others. In town she had been a curiosity at best, a mockery at worst. But the West, she told herself, might be different. There she could be useful. There, her hands and back and courage might be worth more than a corseted waistline. In St. Louis, she switched coaches, handing over the envelope with Walter's address written neatly across it. The driver nodded and pointed her to a smaller wagon heading farther west. The towns grew sparser, the roads rougher. The land stretched into vast plains, dotted with black cattle and the occasional grove of trees. Dust crept into her skirts. under her nails, into the pages of her journal. And still she wrote. She wrote about the color of the soil, red and dry. She wrote about the sky, too vast to measure. She wrote about the silence that hung heavy in the mornings, and the way the sun felt like a different kind of fire. 3 days out from Dodge's Creek, the coach stopped in a town called Elkhorn. For the night, Rosa stayed in a boarding house with thin walls and bitter coffee. A woman named Agnes shared her room, a nurse traveling to meet her brother. She was in her 40s with a limp from a childhood fever and a sharp tongue. "You off to marry someone?" Agnes asked over a supper of stale bread and beans. Rosa hesitated, then nodded. "We've exchanged letters. His name's Walter." "Ever laid eyes on him?" "No." Agnes raised a brow but said nothing more. That night, Rosa listened to the wind rattle the window and thought about how far she'd come and how little she knew about what waited ahead when she finally arrived. In Dodge's Creek, it was nearly sundown. The town was small, a few dozen buildings clustered along a winding road, a saloon at one end and a church at the other. Children played near a well, a dog barked, and everywhere, men in worn coats watched her descend from the stagecoach with open curiosity. Rosa stepped onto the ground and felt the weight of eyes on her. She straightened her shoulders, smoothed her skirt, and looked around. "Miss Whitman?" She turned to see a man approaching, a lanky figure in a dusty coat and sun-faded hat. He held his hat in one hand, frowning slightly. His face was narrower than she'd imagined, with sharp cheekbones and a hesitant smile. His eyes flicked over her, resting for a moment too long. "I'm Walter," he said. Rosa extended her hand. "It's good to meet you, Mr. Latham." He took her hand briefly, his grip dry and light. You traveled well?" "Yes, thank you." Walter looked around. "I have a wagon out back. You'll be staying with Mrs. Hanley for now, until things are settled." There was something in his tone tight, uncomfortable. Rosa felt her chest tighten, but she said nothing. She followed him to the wagon, hoisted herself up with effort, and stared ahead at the land that would maybe become her home. The ride was short and awkward. Walter said little. Rosa asked about his ranch, about the town, about the winters. He answered in clipped phrases. When they arrived at the boarding house, he helped her down but didn't meet her eyes. "I'll come by tomorrow," he said. "There's a lot to think about." Rosa stood in the doorway long after he left, her suitcase in hand. Mrs. Hanley greeted her kindly, showed her to a small room at the back. The bed was narrow but clean. The window overlooked a grove of sycamores. That night, Rosa unpacked her things, placed her locket on the knitstand, and sat on the edge of the bed in silence. The stillness of the West, once thrilling, now felt like a great, looming hush. She removed Walter's letters from her handbag, reading each one again with fresh eyes. Had she misread his kindness? Had he ever really seen her? Outside, the prairie. Wind picked up, rustling the trees. Rosa lay down, closed her eyes, and told herself she had not come all this way to be afraid. But fear, like the wind, found its way in through the smallest cracks. The morning in Dodge's Creek began with the call of a distant rooster and the low groan of a wagon wheel rolling over uneven ground. Rosa sat at the edge of the bed, already dressed, her hair pinned into a modest bun. The small mirror above the wash basin reflected her face, tired from travel, but composed. Her hands rested quietly on her lap, though her fingers trembled slightly with anticipation. Mrs. Hanley had prepared breakfast: fried potatoes, eggs, and thick slices of toasted bread. Rosa thanked her politely and sat alone at the end of the long kitchen table, the chair creaking faintly beneath her weight. The other boarders had already left for the day. The house was still, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floor and the whisper of wind through the narrow windows. Walter had promised to return that morning. Rosa glanced toward the window several times, listening for the sound of hooves or the distant murmur of conversation. When he finally arrived, The sound of his boots on the porch steps made her heart beat faster. She smoothed her skirt and took a breath before rising. Walter stepped inside, dust on his collar, his expression unreadable. He removed his hat with slow fingers, nodded briefly, and said, "Are you ready to come see the place?" Rosa nodded, her voice catching slightly in her throat. "Yes, I am." They walked in silence to his wagon, the sun just beginning to climb above the rooftops. The town was waking up, shopkeepers unlocking doors, women hanging laundry, dogs barking in alleys. Rosa noticed how the people looked at her, their glances lingering longer than necessary. One woman whispered something to her companion, who laughed into her palm. Rosa kept her eyes forward. The road out to Walter's ranch was narrow and rutted, bordered by endless stretches of prairie. The grass bent gently in the breeze, swaying like 1,000 golden hands reaching toward the sky. Birds wheeled overhead, calling to each other in sharp cries. Walter said little, focusing on the path ahead. Rosa studied the horizon, trying to imagine her life in this new world. When they arrived, Rosa saw the ranch house, a modest structure with a sagging roof and faded shutters. A barn stood nearby, its paint peeling, with a pair of tired-looking horses inside the paddock. A few cattle grazed in the distance, their movements slow and deliberate. Walter helped her down from the wagon, but still he did not look her in the eye. Rosa adjusted her shawl and glanced around. The land was quiet, the sky wide and pale. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the unfamiliar scent of sun-warmed earth. "It is a good piece of land," she said, trying to sound cheerful. "There is a stillness here I think I could grow fond of." Walter cleared his throat. "It is manageable, needs work." He led her through the front door. Inside, the air was musty with the scent of old wood and unwashed linen. The furniture was sparse: a wooden table, 2 chairs, a worn armchair near the hearth. A rifle hung above the fireplace, and a few books rested on a shelf beside a cracked window. Rosa imagined herself there, sweeping the floor, cooking meals, planting flowers beneath the window. It was not grand, but it could become something. With patience, with care, she turned toward him, her voice gentle. It could be a fine home. Walter shifted on his feet, eyes fixed on a knot in the floorboard. "You are not what I expected." The words fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Rosa blinked, uncertain she had heard him correctly. "I am sorry?" Walter rubbed the back of his neck. "You are more than I thought, bigger." She felt the words settle against her chest, heavy and unwelcome. Her breath caught, but she did not allow her expression to change. "I sent a photograph," she said calmly. "I did not hide myself." "I saw it," he replied quickly, "but photographs can be misleading." He finally looked at her, and the discomfort in his face was unmistakable. He was not cruel, at least not intentionally, but his disappointment was plain. "I thought you might be more practical for the work," he added. "The size of you folk will talk." Rosa stood straighter, her hands once folded gently in front of her, now clenched at her sides. "Do you believe I cannot work because of my size? Or are you more concerned with how others will judge you?" Walter looked away. "I meant no offense," he muttered. "Perhaps not," Rosa replied, her voice steady, "but you have given it all the same." There was a long silence between them. Outside, a hawk circled above the field, its cry echoing across the prairie. "I do not think this arrangement will work," he said at last. "I am sorry." Rosa nodded slowly. "I see." Walter shifted, clearly eager for the conversation to end. "I will take you back to town." "No," Rosa said, lifting her chin. "I will walk." "You do not need to. I do not need to be driven away like an unwanted burden." She turned and stepped out the door, the hem of her dress catching briefly on a splintered board. She did not look back. The road to town stretched ahead, dusty and sunlit. Each step was hard-won, her boots scraping against the gravel. She passed a grove of trees, a rusted fence, a cluster of wildflowers swaying in the wind. Her heart ached not, just from the rejection, but from the weight of old fears made real. She had traveled hundreds of miles to be seen, to be chosen. And still, her worth had been measured by the same narrow scale. When she returned to the boarding house, Mrs. Hanley opened the door with a surprised expression. "I thought you were gone for good," the older woman said. Rosa brushed dust from her skirt and lifted her head. "It appears I am not." Mrs. Hanley did not ask for details. She stepped aside and let Rosa pass, offering her a quiet place to rest. That evening, Rosa sat by the window in her small room, watching the sky darken. The town was quieter now. The children had returned to their homes, and the lamps in the windows glowed softly against the coming night. She wrote in her journal by candlelight. She did not mention Walter by name. Instead, she wrote about the disappointment that comes when hope collides with reality. She wrote about strength, the kind that does not live in muscles or appearance, but in the quiet refusal to be made small. The next morning, she rose early. The pain of rejection still lingered, but she refused to let it define her. She put on her best dress, pinned her hair neatly, and stepped out into the town once more. She found work at the livery stable, cleaning stalls and organizing supplies. The owner, Mr. Buchanan, was a wiry man with a limp and a gruff voice, but he paid her fairly and did not ask questions. "You know your way around a broom," he said after the first day. "I know my way around hard work," Rosa replied. Days passed slowly. Townsfolk continued to look at her with curiosity, some with amusement, others with quiet sympathy. She ignored them. She walked with her head high, shoulders back, refusing to shrink beneath their stares. One afternoon, she passed Walter in the general store. He was speaking with another woman, young, slender, with golden curls and a laugh like wind chimes. He saw Rosa and stiffened, but she only nodded politely and continued on. There was no hatred in her gaze, only calm. She had been dismissed. Yes, but she had not been broken. In the evenings, she returned to her room at Mrs. Hanley's house, her skirts streaked with dust and her arms aching from the day's labor. She washed her hands carefully, sat by the fire, and wrote letters to her sister. Grace's replies were warm and full of concern, urging her to return home. But Rosa knew she could not. Not yet. There was something in this wild place that still called to her. Not Walter, not marriage. Something quieter, deeper. A chance to belong not to someone, but to herself. She began to frequent the library. Such as it was, a small shelf in the back of the church where old books gathered dust. There she met the preacher's wife, a pale woman with kind eyes who offered her a worn copy of Jane Eyre and said, "I think you will like this one." Rosa devoured the story, reading late into the night. She saw herself in the quiet strength of Jane, in her resilience, her dignity, her refusal to be silenced. She read passages aloud, letting the words fill the room like music. One evening, as she stepped outside to collect water, she saw a man leaning against the fence near the boarding house. He wore a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat, his features hidden by the growing dusk. "Evening, miss," he said, tipping his hat. "You are Rosa Whitman, I believe." She studied him carefully. He had a quiet manner, but there was warmth in his voice. His face was sun-darkened, with eyes that held no mockery, only curiosity. "I am," she said. "I saw you at the livery," he replied. "You work hard." "I was raised to do so." He smiled slightly. "So was I." They stood in silence. For a moment, the wind whispering through the grass. "My name is Jack Maddox," he said. "I am new to town. Thought I should introduce myself." Rosa nodded, cautious but not cold. "It is good to meet you." He nodded in return and stepped away into the dark, leaving only the faint scent of smoke and leather behind. Rosa watched him disappear into the shadows. Something in his presence lingered, quiet and unexpected. She returned to her room, her heart oddly steady. She did not know what would come next. But for the first time in weeks, her thoughts did not circle the same pain. Something had shifted. Something had begun. The mornings grew colder as autumn crept slowly into the bones of Dodge's Creek. Frost clung to the porch railings and the edges of wagon wheels, and the breath of every horse and passerby curled visibly in the crisp air. Rosa Whitman had come to appreciate the silence of the early hour, when the town still slumbered beneath gray skies and the wind stirred only the dead leaves along the roads. Each day she rose before sunrise, wrapped herself in a thick shawl, and walked the half-mile stretch to the livery, her boots crunching across the frosted ground. Her steps were steady now, no longer weighed by doubt or shame. Her back had grown stronger, her hands more calloused, and the ache in her shoulders was no longer a source of complaint, but a badge of quiet pride. Rosa had grown accustomed to the work. She mucked out stalls, hauled water, patched leather reins, and learned to calm skittish horses with a whisper and a firm hand. Mr. Buchanan, whose manner remained as rough as the heels of his boots, had come to trust her implicitly. "You work harder than any 2 boys I ever hired," he remarked one afternoon, nodding toward her with grudging respect. "You do not fuss, you do not quit, and you do not run your mouth. That is more than most can say." Rosa accepted the compliment with a nod. She did not need flattery. She needed purpose, and in this dusty stable beneath the sweeping sky, she had found it. The townsfolk still looked at her, but their expressions had shifted. Where once she had felt the weight of ridicule, now she saw something else: curiosity, perhaps, or quiet admiration. Children no longer pointed when she passed, and the shopkeeper no longer hesitated before offering her the best apples. Respect, she had come to realize, was not granted, it was earned, and earned slowly. Jack Maddox appeared now and then, always at the edges of her routine. He would tip his hat as he passed by the stables, offer to carry a sack of feed, or linger outside the boarding house to exchange a few polite words. Rosa did not ask where he had come from or what had brought him to Dodge's Creek. He was a man of few words, but each one he spoke seemed chosen with care. One evening, after a long day tending to a sick mare, Rosa sat beneath the porch awning with a tin cup of warm cider. The air was sharp with the scent of burning leaves, and the stars above twinkled through a veil of silver cloud. Jack approached without ceremony, his coat trailing dust behind him. "You look like a woman who has earned her rest," he said, leaning against the porch post. "I have," Rosa replied without hesitation, "but I have more to earn tomorrow." He smiled faintly. "There's a rhythm to you, like the land." She looked at him then, more closely than before. His face was weathered but not worn down. His eyes were pale green, like sagebrush in summer, and there was a steadiness to his presence that grounded her more than his words. "You speak like a poet," she said. "Only when the silence invites it," he answered. They fell quiet together, watching the sky fade from copper to charcoal. In the distance, a coyote called to the night. In the following weeks, Jack's presence became a gentle fixture in Rosa's days. He helped repair the stable's western fence after a storm pulled it down. He showed her how to shoe a horse properly, explaining each step with quiet patience. When a young colt broke loose and bolted into the woods, it was Jack who helped her track it, guiding her through the thickets with the ease of a man born to the wilderness. They did not speak often of personal things, but in the quiet moments, understanding passed between them like threads being woven into cloth. One evening, as they stood beneath the bare branches of a cottonwood, Jack turned toward her and said, "There is a strength in you, Rosa, the kind that does not break when things go wrong." She looked at him, eyes steady. "I have learned not to crumble simply because others do not see my worth." He nodded, his voice soft. "Then you see it yourself. That is enough." Still, not everything was easy. The town remained wary of anything that did not fit its expectations. A few men at the saloon joked about her behind half-full mugs. Some women crossed the street rather than walk beside her. Rosa heard the laughter, felt the sidelong glances. But she no longer flinched when Mr. Buchanan caught wind of one man calling her a bull of a bride. He threw the man out of the livery and banned him for good. "You do not speak about decent folk that way," he had growled. "Not while I am drawing breath." The show of loyalty stunned Rosa, though she never spoke of it aloud. Instead, she carried herself with quiet dignity, knowing now that dignity earned was dignity kept. Letters from home came every 2 weeks. Grace wrote about school, about the changing leaves in Green Hollow, about their mother's jam recipes. Rosa responded faithfully, never mentioning Walter or the rejection that had once haunted her. That chapter had been closed, its pages turned. Winter arrived with a brittle wind and long nights. Snow crept across the ground in slow, silent waves, blanketing the stables, the rooftops, and the long fence posts that stretched toward the hills. Rosa continued her work despite the cold, her breath forming clouds before her, her fingers red. From frost. She fell ill once, with a fever that left her shaking beneath quilts for 3 days. Mrs. Hanley watched over her, bringing broth and cool cloths, and Jack came each evening. Sitting in the corner and reading aloud from one of the library books she had borrowed. "You read beautifully," she murmured one night, her voice hoarse. "It is your book," he replied. "I thought it should still be heard." By the time the fever broke, Rosa found that she had missed the sound of his voice more than the story itself. After her recovery, Jack invited her to ride out beyond the northern ridge. It was a clear day, the snow freshly fallen but not yet deep. He brought 2 horses, one a sturdy gelding with a gentle temperament. They rode in silence at first, the world around them sparkling in the winter sun. As they climbed higher into the hills, Rosa breathed in the cold air, felt it cleanse something inside her. At the top of the ridge, Jack dismounted and helped her down. Together, they stood looking out over the valley below, snow-covered fields, winding rivers, and far beyond, the blue silhouette of mountains. "It is beautiful," Rosa whispered. "It is home," Jack replied. They turned toward one another, the wind lifting strands of her hair and carrying them across her face. Jack reached out and tucked them gently behind her ear. "You belong here," he said. "Not because someone brought you. Because you stayed." Her breath caught. No one had ever spoken to her that way. Not with reverence. Not with truth. "I came here believing I would be chosen," she said quietly. "But I had to choose myself first." He smiled. "And now, I choose the sky. I choose the land. I choose this life." Jack took her hand, his grip warm despite the cold. "Then perhaps you might choose me too, in time." She did not answer with words. She met his gaze, and in that look was all the hope and fire she had once thought lost. As they descended the ridge, Rosa realized she no longer carried the weight of being unloved. She had built a life from her own labor, carved dignity from hardship, and found not a rescuer, but a companion. When they returned to town, the streets were still and white. Smoke curled from chimneys, and lanterns glowed behind frosted glass. Rosa looked at the town once so cold, so full of unkind eyes, and felt no bitterness. The future was not yet written, but it would be hers to shape. The last of winter passed with a sigh, and spring returned to Dodge's Creek like a long-awaited letter from home. The snow melted slowly into the thirsty ground, swelling the creeks and softening the soil. Wildflowers emerged in hesitant clusters. Along the fence rows, their petals trembling in the breeze. Rosa had never known a place to change so completely in so short a time. It was not unlike herself. Her days remained filled with labor, feeding, mending, lifting, scrubbing, but her evenings began to take on a different shape. Jack would often appear just as the sun dipped behind the hills, a quiet presence at the edge of her routine. Sometimes he helped her finish the last of her tasks. Other times he simply walked beside her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn coat, listening. They never made formal plans. He never called on her in the manner most suitors did. But there was a rhythm to his visits when she began to count on without realizing it. And when a day passed without seeing him, a part of her felt oddly still, as though a note in a familiar song had gone missing. One such evening, Rosa sat on the back steps of the boarding house, peeling potatoes, with a dull knife and watching the clouds move in low over the hills. Jack approached carrying a sack of apples and a small tin box. "I found these near an old orchard," he said, placing the apples gently beside her. "Thought you might make something warm with them." Rosa looked up, then down at the tin. "And that? Biscuits." "My mother's recipe, though I have likely forgotten half the steps. Still edible, I hope." She opened the lid and smiled. "They are a little burnt. I never said I was a good cook. You also never said you would try. I did not have reason before." She blinked, the humor fading softly into something quieter. "And now you do?" Jack sat beside her, his boots resting firmly on the step below. He looked out toward the horizon. "I have never met a woman like you. I have known beauty, and I have known strength, but I have not often found them in the same person." Rosa looked down at the apple in her hand, her fingers motionless. "You should not say such things unless you mean them." "I have never said anything I did not mean." The silence stretched between them, thick with things neither had yet said aloud. Rosa placed the knife gently beside the bowl and turned toward him. "I came here to be a wife. That was the plan. I believed someone would choose me, and then I would become part of his world, his home, his story." Jack nodded slowly. "And now?" "Now I see I am already part of my own story. I am no longer waiting to be invited into someone else's." He met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Then perhaps we might write something together. As equals, as people who have known hardship and still find meaning." She did not speak right away, but her hand found his, and in that small gesture, her answer unfolded. Still, not all was simple. Word of their growing bond began to ripple through the town. Whispers followed her through the streets, some surprised, some mocking, some plainly resentful. "I heard the big girl has caught herself a cowboy," one woman muttered at the dry goods store, not bothering to lower her voice. "I reckon he is just being kind," another replied. "No man chooses that willingly," Rosa heard it. She always heard it. But she did not flinch. That night, she told Jack everything. Not because she needed his defense, but because she refused to build anything on silence. "I have no desire to be someone's secret," she said. "If we are to build anything, it must begin in the light." Jack did not argue. Instead, he took her hand in his and led her to the church steps the next Sunday. Arriving early, while the bell still hung silent in its tower, they sat together, side by side, as the townspeople filed in. Some did double takes. Others avoided looking at them at all. The preacher nodded kindly, though his wife raised an eyebrow that never lowered. But Jack kept his arm beside hers. Rosa sat tall, and though no words were spoken, the message was clear. They would not hide. Later that week, a man named Eli Hendricks, a cattle driver known for his loud opinions and sharper tongue, approached Rosa outside the livery. "Heard you are sweet on Jack Maddox," he said, spitting tobacco into the dirt. Man must have taken a knock to the head. Rosa did not look up from her work. She lifted a saddle blanket and began folding it with care. "I did not ask your opinion, Mr. Hendricks." "Well, you are getting it anyway. A man like that deserves better than some oversized washwoman with no breeding." She stood slowly, turning to face him. Her voice was even. "And what do you deserve, Mr. Hendricks? A medal for your cruelty? A prize for your ignorance?" He shifted, uncertain how to respond. Rosa stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. I may be large. I may be different, but I am not less. And I do not require your approval to be loved. He muttered something under his breath and stalked off. Mr. Buchanan, who had witnessed the exchange, from the stable door, gave Rosa a nod of approval. You put him in his place, he said. About time someone did. Despite the momentary victories, Rosa knew the road ahead would not be smooth. Jack had his own past, one he rarely spoke of. He had been a scout during the war, had seen violence most men could not name. He had lost a brother to fever and a mother to grief. He had wandered from place to place for years, unwilling to settle anywhere. Until now, I did not believe in roots, he confessed one night, as they sat watching the fireflies. Not until I met someone who grew despite every storm. She placed her hand over his. Then perhaps it is time to plant something that lasts. Their first kiss was not under moonlight or in a field of wildflowers. It was on the livery's back porch, as she wiped her brow with a kerchief, and he stepped forward without a word. It was brief, tender, and filled with the quiet intensity of people who had waited a long time to feel safe out later that night. Rosa sat at her desk and wrote in her journal. The pages were filled not with dreams, but with truths. She wrote of work of trust, of the slow-burning hope that something lasting could grow from soil once considered barren. When spring gave way to summer, the prairie turned golden. Crops rose tall in the fields, and Rosa began to dream of planting her own. Jack spoke of buying land, a modest plot near the river, where the soil was dark and rich. He asked her, not as a request, but as a partnership, will you come with me? Not just to the land, but to the life I want to build? And Rosa, without hesitation, said yes, not because she had been chosen at last, but because she had chosen herself long ago, and now someone had met her there. The land Jack spoke of lay 3 miles west of Dodge's Creek, past the edge of the rolling plains where the river bent like a silver ribbon between the hills. It was not much to look at, not at first. A weathered fence marked the boundary, and the remnants of an old cabin slumped near the cottonwoods, its roof half-caved and door swinging like a loose tooth. But Rosa saw it for what it could become, not what it had been. She stepped from the wagon with a steady gaze, the breeze lifting the edge of her shawl, and walked the length of the field in silence. The earth beneath her boots was soft, dark, and full of promise. A pair of red-tailed hawks circled high overhead. This is it, Jack said, following her gaze. It is not much yet. It is enough, she replied, because it is ours. They signed the deed in late June. The notary came up from Laramie with a saddlebag full of papers and a bottle of dusty ink. Rosa wrote her name with slow care, each letter steady and final. When the document was sealed and the man gone, she and Jack stood alone with the land. Their first night was spent inside the broken shell of the old cabin, the firelight flickering against warped planks and open rafters. The wind howled through the cracks, but Rosa did not feel afraid. Jack had gathered fresh straw for bedding, and they shared a meal of beans and cornbread with their backs pressed together for warmth. I never imagined my life would come to this, she murmured, her hand resting near the hem of his coat. Jack turned toward her. And is that a disappointment? She smiled. No, it is a miracle, one I helped build. By dawn they had a plan. Jack would see to the roof while Rosa focused on clearing the garden plot. They worked side by side as the days stretched long, and the sun beat down on their shoulders. Rosa's arms grew stronger. Her hands blistered, healed, and blistered again. She did not complain. Each evening they washed their faces in the river, shared bread and cheese, and watched the stars appear like lanterns in the vast western sky. There was no pretense between them, no need for flattery or performance. Only truth, worn plain and open like a calloused palm. One afternoon in July, Rosa discovered an old root cellar buried beneath the wild grass behind the cabin. She unearthed the entrance with her shovel, and Jack helped her pry the door open. Inside, the air was cool and musty, the stone walls still intact. It would serve well for storing vegetables come harvest, and perhaps even for preserving meat. Through the winter, they lit a lantern and explored it together, stepping carefully along the uneven floor. Someone once kept their whole life in here, Rosa said, tracing her fingers along the wall. And now we will, Jack replied. In town, the rumors never quite ceased. Some still referred to her as that big girl who landed a cowboy, though the tone had begun to shift. Fewer snickered. More looked on with curiosity or even quiet approval. Mrs. Hanley brought over a bundle of fabric scraps and offered them. For curtains, Mr. Buchanan donated a sturdy iron stove for the cabin. Even the preacher stopped by one Sunday with a book of psalms and a jar of pickled beets. "You are building something good out there," he said, his eyes soft with recognition. "That does not go unnoticed." Still, not everyone wished them. Well, Walter Granger returned to Dodge's Creek in late summer, riding in with a team of traders from Kansas. He was leaner than Rosa remembered, with a sour crease between his eyes and a coat worn thin at the elbows. She saw him first at the general store, standing beside a barrel of molasses, his expression slack with disbelief. "You are still here," he said, as though the fact offended him. "I am," Rosa replied. "And I am well. I heard a story," he said, stepping closer, "that you found someone fool enough to marry you." "I found someone brave enough to love me," she corrected, her voice even. "And I found the courage to love myself first." Walter scoffed. "You always were. Too proud for your own good." "No," Rosa said. "I was always waiting for someone to see my worth. Now I do not need them to." She left him standing in the aisle, mouth slack and arms limp. She did not turn back. Jack listened quietly when she told him about the encounter. His jaw set but his voice calm. Men like that do not understand strength in a woman. It makes them feel smaller. "I am no longer here to make anyone feel comfortable," she said. They celebrated their union on a warm September afternoon with a small gathering under the trees behind the cabin. There was no preacher, no ring, and no white dress. Rosa wore a blue cotton gown with her mother's lace stitched along the hem. Jack wore his best shirt and a clean pair of boots. The preacher's wife brought a pie. Mrs. Hanley cried quietly and handed Rosa a handkerchief. "I have never seen a woman stand taller than you do," she whispered, "even when you sit." They exchanged vows in their own words. Simple promises. To work side by side, to listen, to protect, to endure. When Jack took her hands and looked into her eyes, Rosa felt the years fall away, the shame, the silence, the fear of being too much or never enough. All of it burned off like fog under the morning sun. "I did not come looking for love," she said. "But I found it in your hands, in your voice, in your patience," Jack replied. "And I found it in your strength, in your heart, in the way you did not break." That night they danced beneath the stars, their footsteps slow in the dust. There was no music save the wind and the call of night birds. But Rosa would remember the rhythm forever. The seasons turned once more. Autumn brought color to the hills and a golden hush to the air. Their first harvest was modest but good: squash, onions, beans, and a handful of potatoes. Rosa lined the cellar shelves with jars of preserves, tied each with cloth, and labeled them in tidy script. One evening, as she was washing the last of the canning jars in the basin, Jack appeared in the doorway, a folded paper in his hand. "A letter from Grace," he said. Rosa dried her hands and opened the envelope, her heart lifting as her sister's familiar handwriting spilled across the page. Grace spoke of school, of a boy she liked, of their mother's growing health. Then, at the bottom, "You are the bravest woman I know, Rosa. You did not settle for someone who did not see you. You waited. You worked. You won. Rosa folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the drawer beside her journal. She would read it again many times. In the months that followed, life continued to blossom around them, not in grand events, but in quiet certainties. A calf born healthy, a neighbor's barn raised with shared hands, a quilt finished on a stormy afternoon. Jack built her a rocking chair from pine. Rosa carved their names into its back with a pocket knife. One night, as they sat before the fire with their boots off and their fingers laced, Jack asked her, "Do you regret how you came here? That you came for one man and found another?" Rosa shook her head. "I came for something better than I had. I stayed because I found something better than I dreamed." Outside, the wind moved through the tall grass, bending it without breaking it, much like her. The first frost came earlier than expected. One morning in late October, Rosa opened the cabin door to find the fields cloaked in white. The grass cracked beneath her boots, and her breath rose like smoke in the clear air. She tightened her shawl around her shoulders and smiled. The earth was sleeping, but beneath its surface, life waited. Inside, the fire crackled steadily in the stove Jack had reinforced with bricks. A stew simmered in a cast-iron pot, and the scent of herbs hung in the air. Rosa moved easily through the room, her hands strong, her step sure. She had learned every corner of this house they had made. She had helped raise every wall, sand every floorboard, sew every curtain. As winter approached, they prepared the land for rest. Jack stacked the last of the chopped wood beneath the porch, while Rosa sorted the dried beans and potatoes for storage. The pantry shelves were lined with jars of preserves, flour sacks, and herbs hanging in bundles from the beams. There was no waste, no excess, only what they needed, and enough to share when others came calling. They lived quietly but never in isolation. Neighbors came often now, not out of curiosity or gossip, but out of friendship. Rosa baked bread for the widow Lane when her son took ill. Jack helped repair the wheel of a young couple's wagon on their journey west. In return, others offered what they could: candles, cloth, stories, laughter. One stormy evening, the preacher returned, bringing with him a package wrapped in oilcloth. It contained a Bible with leather binding and a letter inside. It belonged to a woman like you, he said. One who never bowed to the world's opinion. I think she would have wanted you to have it. Rosa took the book into her hands and held it for a long while. It was not religion that moved her, but the legacy of another woman who had endured. By December, snow blanketed the hills in silence. Their days grew shorter, but their evenings longer and richer. Jack took to reading aloud by lamplight, while Rosa stitched quilts from scraps of old clothes and memories. The fire glowed against their faces as the wind howled beyond the walls. One night, as the storm raged loudest, Rosa turned to Jack and said softly, "Do you think we are known now? Seen not as curiosities, but as part of this place." Jack reached for her hand. "We have planted ourselves deeply, and even the hardest winter cannot undo roots like that." In early spring, Rosa felt the first stirrings in her body, unfamiliar yet unmistakable. She kept quiet at first, uncertain whether it was hope or mischief from her own heart. But as the days passed and her breath shortened with small exertions, as a strange fullness settled in her belly, she understood. She told Jack beneath the cottonwood tree where they had first marked out the edge of their land. He listened, wide-eyed and silent, then wrapped his arms around her as though she might vanish. "You are certain?" he asked. "Yes, and if the child has your eyes, I hope they have my spirit." He laughed through quiet tears. "Or perhaps the other way around." Rosa worked through the months that followed, her pace slower, but her resolve undiminished. Jack insisted she rest more, brought her tea brewed from the mint they had grown near the porch, and rubbed her feet in the evenings with his calloused hands. They added a small room to the back of the cabin, not grand but bright, with a crib. Jack built from ash wood and a quilt Rosa made from her mother's dresses. When the child came a girl, full of sound and life, it was early morning, the sun rising just beyond the ridge. Rosa labored fiercely and without complaint, gripping Jack's hand and breathing deep through every wave. When the baby cried, Rosa cried too, not from pain but from the overwhelming truth of what they had made. They named her Clara. The townsfolk came to visit, one by one, bearing knitted socks, wooden toys, and casseroles wrapped in towels. No one questioned the family they had become. No one asked how or why. It was understood now, woven into the story of Dodge's Creek. Rosa wrote to Grace again, enclosing a sketch of the baby and a lock of Clara's dark hair tied with ribbon. "She's the sum of everything I have ever loved." The letter read, "She will grow tall and strong. She will not be told she is too much. She will be enough from the start." Grace wrote back with joy, promising to visit when the roads thawed. Rosa kept the letter folded in the drawer beside Clara's first blanket. The years passed gently. Clara grew into a fierce, curious child who asked endless questions and climbed trees barefoot. She followed Jack into the field with her toy spade, pretending to plant her own crops. At night, she curled in Rosa's lap while stories were told, some from books, others from Rosa's own memory. And as Clara grew, so too did the land. The garden yielded more each year. Jack added a second barn, and Rosa taught herself to bind books in the winter months. They sold preserves and quilted goods to travelers. Their homestead became known as a place of honesty, hard work, and warmth. Rosa, once mocked and dismissed, became a figure of quiet respect. Young women came to her for advice, not only on cooking or sewing, but on strength. How to endure rejection. How to love themselves even when the world did not. One day, a girl not much older than Rosa had been when she first arrived stepped off the coach and found her way to the homestead. She was round-faced and weary, with shame in her eyes. She had come seeking a husband who had never shown. Rosa looked at her, remembered the ache, the confusion, the hollow humiliation, and she opened the door. "You are not lost," Rosa said. "You are not a mistake. You are beginning." The girl stayed a month, helping with Clara and learning to ride. She left with shoulders straighter and a letter of recommendation to a family in Fort Laramie who needed a governess. Before she went, she hugged Rosa tightly and whispered, "You made me feel seen." When she had gone, Rosa stood on the porch and watched the dust settle behind the coach. She smiled. That night, she sat beside Jack with the firelight flickering between them. "Do you remember the day I stepped off the coach?" she asked. "I do. You were wearing green. I was afraid, and I was already halfway in love." She reached for his hand, still rough, still warm. "I want Clara to know what it cost to get here. I want her to understand how far we have come." "She will," Jack said, "because she lives in the house you built. Because she is loved without limit." The wind shifted outside, carrying the scent of earth and new blossoms. Spring had come again. Rosa leaned back in her chair, the wooden frame creaking with familiarity. Her body had changed with time, heavier, yes, but stronger too. Her hands bore scars of labor and joy. Her hair was streaked with gray, and her eyes still held fire. She did not shrink herself. She never would. She had been a mail-order bride once. A woman judged for her size, mocked for her softness, discarded for daring to hope, but she had become so much more: a wife, a mother, a landowner, a woman who loved fiercely and without apology. She had not waited for someone to choose her, thought she had chosen herself. And in doing so, she had built a life that could never be erased.